Welcome to the Holistic High Achiever podcast. I'm your host, Kaitlin Rohowetz. This podcast is all about thriving in the modern world without sacrificing your health. It's for all of my fellow high achievers, business owners, mompreneurs, and hustlers, the people who do so much for everyone else and sometimes at a detriment to their own health. The people who need to find a better way without burning themselves out or continuing to put their own health on the back burner. Yes, we talk about health, nutrition, and movement and easy solutions to living healthier, but we also cover topics like goal setting and overcoming challenges and limiting beliefs, which can be applied to any area, including your health, so that you can thrive holistically. I am so excited for today's episode. Today we have a very special guest, and not only is it just we have a special guest, it's our first time recording a guest in person, and I'm very happy that it's Amy because she helps me feel comfortable, and we'll get into all the things of why. But I want to introduce Amy. Amy Pearce-Hayden began her yoga studies alongside her professional actor studies in 1995. She's also the founder of the Raja Hatha School of Yoga, and her centers of ideas around the philosophies of yoga are that absolutely everything is connected. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that today, which just encourages presence in your life so you can watch the magic unfold. And Amy holds certifications in various yoga branches, including Raja, Hatha, Jnana, I was going to not mispronounce that one, Bhakti, and Tantra. She's also trained in these areas since 2004, which makes 2024 20 years.
Yeah, I have been training teachers for 20 years.
Wow, that's incredible. She's also the co-author of Living the Sutras book, which I'm sure will come up also in conversation, and the co-host of her own podcast, Living It, which is phenomenal, by the way. And she's also the creator of the Live Your Yoga card deck. Thank you so much for being here. I hope I didn't butcher any of those.
That was perfect. It's really an honor to hear your own bio spoken by somebody else's words.
Right.
Very interesting thing.
Yeah.
I'm really thrilled to be here. At first, I didn't know we were going to be in person, and my podcast is all audio. But now I'm starting to understand why in person is so wonderful.
It just gives a little bit more of that connection piece, I feel like.
For sure.
And obviously I'll have guests that are, in Seattle. I'm going to be recording one and we can't do in person, but if we have the opportunity, I think it's just a nice charisma piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
During the middle of our podcast was the pandemic, or towards the end of our second season. And my co-author, Kelly DiNardo, moved back to DC where her studio had been running while she was in Madison. And so we had to figure out how to have three-way podcasts virtually.
Oh, wow.
So if you want to talk about technical high achieving, you don't know what you're doing, we talked to a bunch of people and figured out how we could communicate while interviewing a third person and not talking over each other, all virtually.
Yeah.
And so Kelly and I found our own magic hand signals. We'd be on FaceTime on mute so that we could see each other, and we'd be thinking, we'd be giving cure. I'd say, look at her, and I'd say, and so it was a fun way to sort of really learn how to listen.
Yeah.
Which is a big part of course, this work.
Everything. Yeah.
Everything.
Everything. We're on it.
Everything.
Yeah. That's really incredible. But I think it's also just as high achievers, when there's something you want to do, you figure out a way out of it. That's one of the things I want to start with. I'm sure we'll have like a plethora of things to talk about today, but I wanted to start out by having you tell a little bit of your story and kind of your journey of how you got into yoga and then how that turned into like starting your own business and practice and the journey of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Well, I'll start by saying I'm really starting to take a step back and look at where the entrepreneurship originated. And one of my clues is watching my daughter, who's 9 now, replicate my entrepreneurship as a kid. So my first bout of entrepreneurship was in the first house that my parents bought after they left Chicago when I was a toddler.
Okay.
I was in that house until I think I was about 7 or 8 when my sister had been born, and my parents were going to build a house. And in order to sell this house, they needed to renovate the bathroom. And so I recognized that this worker was going in and out of the hallway to the bathroom from the front door. So I set up a toll booth, and I was about 6 years old. And so I committed to sitting there all day. I think my mom must have given the guy a handful of coins.
Yeah.
And I sat there to make money collecting a toll. So at the age of 6, 7, I was always trying to think about how do I take advantage of the situation?
Yeah.
And reap energy from somebody else's energy.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not what I think of as entrepreneurship entirely, but
But at 7, that's what you had access
that's what I had access to. And then I started making bracelets and bookmarks. I sold them door to door as a little kid. Anyway, last weekend, my daughter put a booth up in 20-degree weather and sold her ceramics.
Oh,
She came in after a half hour and made $26.
good for her.
So, I like things are possible. My point is that if you have your mind, you said it, your
Yep.
mind is set to something.
Yep.
It's really much easier to move toward a vision when you've made a decision, it's the direction you want to go.
Yeah.
So I think that's at the root of everything I've always done.
Yeah.
It became health centered in the mid 90s,
Okay.
mostly out of two things. I was exposed to a traditional yoga teacher when I was in Chicago as part of my curriculum as an actor.
Oh, okay.
Yep, and which we can talk about. And then I'd always been interested in meditation. I was a self-taught meditator as a teenager.
Okay.
I came across a book on yoga in my local library at the age of 11
Wow.
and felt really drawn to it
Mm.
and started on my own studying yoga and meditation without any direction.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I grew up in a pretty traditional Midwestern family with Catholic upbringing.
Yeah.
So I was exposed to ritual and some, a specific form of spirituality. And the parts of it that really appealed to me were the parts that were outside of the walls of the church. I was really interested in what it meant to go and do a rosary, which, of course, if you look at the yoga mala bead, it's a rosary. The word mala means rosary. So there's all of these interesting things that pulled me from a ritualistic place and an interest in health together, but it didn't have a direct line. It's like
Yeah.
one of those lines that did this.
Yeah.
Some of it out of interest, some of it out of necessity.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like that's kind of how courses work, though. You're kind of drawn. And when you first said you stumbled upon the book of meditation when you were
11.
11, part of me was like, is that luck? But no, I think it, some of the times things like that, they happen for a reason. You were drawn to it for a reason.
Yeah,
And you could have easily picked that book up and said, oh, not interested.
right.
But you picked it up and read it. And so, even though you're trying things and going different directions, some work and some doesn't, that's kind of the definition of entrepreneurship too.
For sure, for sure. And, right place at the right time. Those are all, whether or not those are luck, like you're saying, or actually maybe more divine.
Yeah.
There's a saying in a ancient yoga scripture called the Bhagavad Gita, or a theme, I should say, that the time that you take to do something is really up to you, but what you're going to do is inevitable. And I think that's like my definition of fate. Like I think there are certain things that are inevitable.
Yeah.
For example, I'll tell you the story about Kelly, my writing partner.
Yeah.
So I've been in Madison 10 years, and maybe 15 years ago, 4 or 5 years before I left New York, I went on a hiatus and went for a few weeks out to Sedona, a place I hadn't been.
Yeah.
And my goal was to go into some sort of isolation in the desert, in a spiritual part, what we think of as maybe a spiritual part of the U.S., and start to write my book. And in 2 weeks, I wrote the introduction. I thought I was going to write a book.
Yeah.
And I had it in my head, and I just couldn't decide what part of the Yoga Sutra I wanted to focus on and how it would be most helpful to the public.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say that was probably in 2011 or 12.
Okay.
And I tried to pick it up many times. And the idea of the book was to find um, support for people in training or studying yoga that made this 2,000-year-old science more accessible.
Yeah.
These scriptures are in Sanskrit, and then some of them are translated into Hindi in a script that is called Devanagari, and then it gets translated into English.
I don't know any of
Yeah, and so a lot can be lost in translation, minus the period of time. And I never, when I was training teachers, found a text that answered a lot of the questions that I had when I was studying. And so that was the idea.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 2016, the end of 2016. I was teaching a class here in Madison, not even a regular class, and when I was subbing at a studio that I taught at,
Mm-hmm.
and gave a little Dharma talk in the beginning of the class on one of the sutras. And after the class was over, a very lovely woman came up to me and she said, I think I know who you are. And I said, oh, who am I?
Okay.
And she said, were you on an airplane not so long ago with a gray-haired, very over-friendly woman speaking to you about her daughter who owned a yoga studio? And I said, yes. She said, that was my mom. So on a flight, maybe 6 months before, I had been flying back and forth to New York, still running my studio from Madison. A very sweet older woman had sat down next to me, a grandmotherly type.
Yeah.
And she said, well, where do you live? And I said, well, I live in Madison, but I'm going back and forth between New York and Madison. I'm a yoga teacher and I have a studio. And she said, very much like my mother would have, my daughter's a yoga teacher. She owns a yoga studio. You should be friends. So she gave me her business card. And of course, I wasn't going to call.
Yeah.
Well, I gave her in turn my card. She gave it to her daughter, who also, of course, wasn't going to call.
Yeah.
And that was her 6 months later in my yoga class.
Wow.
And so, that's an example of, I think, an inevitable meeting.
Yeah.
How in all of my flights back and forth to New York would I sit next to this woman whose card I would exchange?
Yeah.
On what day did I decide to sub that class that I wouldn't have otherwise said yes to, happening to have Kelly in that class?
Right.
So that's how my co-author and one of my best friends met.
Wow.
So it was inevitable.
Yeah.
And I needed her to be able to bring this to light. And she, in a longer part of the story, had a similar idea, but wasn't as well versed in the theory as she is a writer.
Oh.
So that's how our two,
Yeah.
bring
You guys
her
balanced
together
out the need there and became friends.
and became great
It was
friends.
inevitable that you would be
It was
friends.
inevitable.
You should be friends. Just
Yeah.
like her mother.
That's exactly. Your mom was right. Listen to your mother.
Listen to your mother.
Listen to your
At all
mother.
times, no matter what.
Yeah. So, I think part of my work as an entrepreneur was the desire to go into a field that really inspired me, but also it felt like I didn't have a choice to some degree.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have felt like that in your work,
A
but
little bit. Yeah.
this path was given to me on some level.
Yeah. I feel like that I'm resonating a lot with what you're saying as far as I don't think I always knew I was going to be an entrepreneur, but once you become one, and then in hindsight, everything is 2020. I think back to, I think my first business was when I was 8 and I started, it was called, I still have a business card. It was called like Triple Star. And it was a babysitting, a dog walking, and a lawn mowing business.
Yeah.
The hilarious part about that is I didn't own a lawnmower. So I'd knock on all the neighbors' doors, like, do you need me to mow your lawn for $20 or whatever? I probably would have done it for $5, to be honest.
Right.
And then I go, oh, by the way, I need to use your lawnmower.
And did you ever get hired to mow the lawn?
I did. I had regulars. I walked several dogs. And then the guy the family whose dogs we walked, they let us come over and swim in their pool. So it was just like all these doors opened. But then, since then I sold raspberries and Kool-Aid stands and lemonade stands. It's in you. Like you said.
It's in you.
Yeah. So whether or not you know exactly what that means at that point, when you look back, you can see that it was going to be inevitable, however it worked out.
Right.
Yeah. I love that. So is that kind of when you say kind of everything is connected, is that part of that philosophy as well?
I've never thought about it in a linear manner, in like the way life unfolds. Certainly it is.
Yeah.
I went to school for theater. I had been studying theater on stage since I was 7 years old.
Yeah.
I went to professional theater camp. Both of the colleges I attended were theater focused. I graduated, with a degree in the theater.
Yeah.
And so never once did I say, I'd like to be an entrepreneur, a yoga teacher, and own a studio.
Yeah.
That there was always something holistic in the work I did and my interests, but it never was a vision.
Yeah.
It never was a vision. So I will say, I think everything is connected. If I look back, I've been exposed to some of the best yoga teachers that the United States could provide.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I knew that right away. I studied with a Iyengar's follower, one of his, longtime devotees. I moved to New York City, and the main lineages in yoga that were present on the East Coast, I ended up being in front of those teachers. So, yes, I think that's part of the everything is connected, but it also makes me believe that everything is provided. And I say that out loud, and it doesn't mean that I always remember it, but I think that if I'm really slowing down, which I'd love to talk about today, I can see what is provided, and then that gives me a cue in which direction to take.
I love that. Yeah. Just knowing that things will work out. There are some things that are inevitable. There are some things that are going to come to you. And I feel like, especially as kind of moving into slowing down, like as high achievers, we have plans and we think we can control everything.
Right.
And, I think to some degree, yes, right? If you don't have a plan, you're just kind of like, I hope things work out. But also, so the slowing down piece, really started struggling to write an episode on like the power of slowing down. And that's when I thought of you. I was like, Amy and I have had these conversations, and I think I brought up Pitta energy in our first conversation. When I was attending a yoga class at the yoga space in Mount Horeb, which I love them, I was at a yin class. And the first time I'd ever even heard that term, Pitta energy, she started talking about how it's kind of like the fire energy. And I go to yoga, but I don't actually know that much about yoga. Like some of these terms that you're throwing out, I'm like, oh, that sounds cool, but I have no idea what it means.
Sure.
So Pitta energy, I'd never even heard of, didn't know what it was. And she kept saying it's when you're really feeling the desire to constantly push yourself. And I was a new mom at that point. And I think I started like tearing up in class, and I was just like, this is me. Why do I feel the desire to push myself all the time? And she's then, had more wisdom to share about balancing it out. But I'd love to
Right.
I'm feeling like a lot of the high achievers that probably listen to this podcast would relate to that, being like constantly pushing yourself and having that fiery energy, which is great, probably in some situations, but not all the time.
Yeah, it's necessary, but it's only necessary to get the ball moving a lot of the time. I'll come back to that. I want to go back to this idea that that you and I kind of can agree that things, you know, can work out or will work out. I think we also have to remember, and what I've reminded myself of in the last, maybe since even COVID,
Yeah,
you know, and some things are not supposed to work out.
that's true.
And I think that's a hard thing for a high achiever to
Yeah,
remember, or to say like, thank goodness that didn't work out.
yeah,
And in the moment, I think that's one of the harder things to hold on to
yeah,
when we have a vision, or when there's a desire to create something, or a need to reconcile something
yep,
professionally or in a relationship, that sometimes that actually is the right thing, that it doesn't
yeah,
work out. And so I think that's something to keep in mind
yeah.
for, I know you talk about this podcast being for even hustlers,
Yes.
and I think there's a glorification of that word,
Oh, for sure.
and it can be really dangerous. When I was in my 20s and 30s, so I formally opened my business at the age of 27, my studio, like the brick and mortar at
Yeah.
27. And I was very willing to hustle.
Mhm.
I was married to my first husband. Our son wouldn't be born for another almost 4 years.
Yeah.
So I had that period of time to really build the business, while kind of slowly leaving a profession that I was in.
Yeah.
But I was absolutely willing to hustle. And I think there comes a point where you're not willing to hustle.
Yes.
And I've reached that point. As I was saying, I'll be 50 soon. And um, it's almost not even in the fabric within me anymore,
Yeah.
when it was deeply in my fabric. So I think for your listeners, it's important to know which period you're in, like to really be honest. Do I want to hustle? And sometimes if the answer isn't yes, it might not be the time to take something on that's new.
Yeah. I love that approach. I just saw everything you're saying reminded me of something I saw, like a meme posted about that said, like, the hustle culture. What they don't understand is that slowing down is not just taking your foot off the gas, it's putting fuel in your gas tank.
Yes.
So I don't even think hustling is meant to be like a 24/7 thing. And I think that gets misconstrued for a lot of
Mm-mm.
people. But I also agree with you at different phases in your life. Like, what are you willing to do? Because mine shifted when I became a mom.
Yes.
I still want to accomplish things and I have big goals and big dreams, but there's a limit to how many hours in a day I'm going to work and how many hours in a day I'm going to take away from my kid. I think life changes, and being aware of that and recognizing, like, is this the season I'm meant to hustle? And I think that is the other piece of it. You can be a high achiever without the constant need to feel
Absolutely.
the hustle.
Absolutely. And I think often we can achieve more at a higher level when we're not in that state.
100%.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So this idea of slowing down,
Yeah.
just this October, I have entered a phase where I haven't worked full time since I was 21.
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting, I made a couple notes for this interview today. It's such an interesting new rhythm. And rhythm is one of the words that I put in my note that I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
When you asked me, like, what are some of the things that you do to maintain balance?
Yeah.
It's me paying attention to a rhythm. Like, what are my internal rhythms? I like to look at the seasonal rhythms. I pay attention to that. I know that by 5 o'clock in the middle of January, when it starts to get dark, I'm not going to feel like doing the project that I thought I would do at 9 a.m.
Yeah.
Where in the,
Yeah.
September, my gas is still more available
Mm.
and it's light out at 7 p.m. I might even cook for the next couple days, like start cooking for the next day or set some things aside where tonight I'm not going to do that at 7 p.m.
Yeah, because
We're already coming
dark
in.
for the
It's dark.
hours by 7 p.m.
Right. So rhythm, I think learning to identify cyclical rhythms,
Yeah.
personal rhythms, rhythms that are happening maybe within a family dynamic or in a relationship for a period of time. You probably have rhythms in business,
Oh, yeah.
right? See a seasonal up or down as far as how many clients you have. Those are all rhythms.
Yeah.
And how do we adjust to them? And how do I not make assumptions about
Mm.
what that rhythm is?
Mhm.
So that's one of the words of my year that I'm really paying attention
I love
to.
that.
Yeah.
I've always used the word pattern, but now I think I'm going to take that. I'm going to use rhythm instead. It feels better.
I think rhythm implies that it's more
Flowy.
fluid. Yes, exactly. And a pattern is a little bit more unconscious, I
Yeah.
think, for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that feels true.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because I just recorded or I have written an outline that's complete and ready to be recorded for what to do when like the pattern or the rhythm is disrupted,
Hmm.
like and how to adjust.
Have you identified an answer to that?
So I give what I personally use, and I give an example because so last Thursday, I'm a planner. Everything in my life is like planned to the 5-minute interval, And I woke up and I had really horrible cramps and Aunt Flo decided to visit. And I had planned to go to boxing class, which is a very intense workout. And I knew my day was not going to go as planned. So I kind of took stock and kind of wrote some steps and thought about like, what do I do when the pattern gets interrupted or the rhythm is disrupted or life throws a curveball, whatever you want to call it. Like,
Right.
what do I do so that at the end of the day, I can still feel like I was successful? Because I think the other direction that it goes is when the unexpected happens, people feel guilt and a shame, like I should have pushed harder, I should have done this, and it doesn't even have to be your period, right? It can be your kid got sick,
Right.
or there was a snowstorm. We live in Wisconsin, but just ending the day feeling like I still did what was best for me and what was most important and taking steps. So the first step is like taking stock and reprioritizing.
Hmm.
Like, what's the new plan, basically?
Right. And I think in a day that can be easier. But for me, when I look at like a year projection or a 5-year projection and it's not going the way that I, planned
Yeah. Yep.
for me, recognizing that I'm attached to something,
Mm.
like, oh, I'm not going to check the success box off unless it went as planned.
Yeah.
And practicing that like in a 24-hour period is so useful because
Yeah.
then maybe we can practice it in a
A
1
bigger
month
picture.
or a bigger picture
Yeah.
and like learning how to make those adjustments and saying, oh, this is actually going to suit me better
Yeah.
if I don't try to stay on that old trajectory.
And that's like what we were saying before about sometimes the plan is for whatever you thought was going to happen to not
Not
actually work
happen.
out.
It's
And
difficult.
yeah, it is. But I think mastering that adjustment and just keeping moving without too much time spent dwelling almost,
Right.
just recognizing this rhythm is not what I thought it was. How do we adjust in a way that's going to serve me
Hmm.
best?
For one of the key words for me, and if you have listeners who are new entrepreneurs, is pivoting.
Mm.
And like I think about that word integrally in decisions I make around even changing something as much as class schedule or when
Yeah.
a retreat might happen
Yep.
or certain things aren't feeling like there's momentum. How do I pivot but not lose the
Yeah.
effort I put into something?
Yeah. Well, and I like that too, because if you think about physically pivoting, you're not like moving entirely, but you shift directions one way or
Right.
another.
One way or another.
I love that. So, can you also explain, like going back to Pitta energy, what in more detail it is? Because my
Mhm.
explanation is probably not as good as yours, and like the power of using that to your advantage, but also what other energies could maybe be present to help us pivot.
So Ayurveda is a very deep science. It's
Yeah.
one of the sister sciences to yoga. There are different yogas.
Okay.
And depending on, where you kind of mark the period of what we understand as Ayurveda today, we could say that the science dates back from a more formal lineage to at least 2 or 3 thousand years, with its roots being 5 or 6 thousand years old. So this is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And it's the science that basically takes a look at the elements. I'll try to oversimplify it. Those elements in the science being earth, water, fire, air, and ether or gas,
Okay.
and how they are presenting themselves in any form. So, for example, you could say that this crystal, of course, is embodying the energy of earth far more than it is water.
Yeah.
They're literal elements, but they're also energetic elements. So, for example, fire, which is the base element of Pitta, you could, without me even educating you, you could understand that that could be passion,
Mm.
it could be anger.
Mhm.
So they're not necessarily positive or negative, but it could be the way an emotion
Mm.
is expressed.
Yeah.
But it's also the way personality is expressed. It's also the way that health or the lack of health is expressed. So, for example, a pitta imbalance, a fire imbalance in the body, one of them is skin heat. So, a rash is a pitta imbalance, or a boil is a pitta imbalance.
Interesting.
A headache is pitta imbalance.
Okay.
Pitta with, when it is balanced, might show up as efficiency, sharp pointedness. It's connected to the sense of sight. So each of these elements is connected to uh, one of the senses.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So high pitta has certain foresight, but from a physical standpoint, if you and I have high pitta, we also will tend to have poor eyesight. Like it's that of all of the doshas, we will lack good sight. So like I got glasses at the age of 9.
Interesting.
Few people with high pitta don't have some kind of weakness in their eyesight.
Interesting.
Not always, but it's a
Yeah.
tendency where if somebody has more of the kapha element earth,
Yep.
they tend to have best vision. So so these elements show up balanced or imbalanced, or we could say one of the ways we look at them in the body and the mind and the spirit is aggravated
Okay.
or kind of dormant.
Hmm.
So everybody has pitta,
Yeah.
everybody has vata, and everybody has kapha. But it depends on the constitution. And there's one way I like to think about it. Like if you think of bread,
Hmm.
all breads throughout the entire world are basically made of the same thing.
Yeah.
Some kind of gluten or wheat
Yeah.
or seed, some kind of liquid, water or an oil or an egg, and some kind of binding agent.
Yep.
Right. And so if you look at there are 5 elements, but each of these doshas have a primary element. So pitta is fire primarily. It's made of fire and water, but let's just call it fire. Kapha is made of earth and water, but its primary is earth. And then the third vata is made of air and ether, basically air. So just think of these earth, fire, and air.
Okay.
You could describe somebody who's airy.
Yes.
You could describe somebody who's fiery
Yep.
and earthy.
Yes.
And so, but we all have these elements, but based upon our conception period, our time literally at conception, our dosha and our prana was determined. And so when balanced, my correct amount of water, yeast, or oil is going to make up my kind of bread. I could be a cracker, and a cracker is very dry. That's vata.
Okay.
Or you could have kind of a medium, like sourdough bread. Right in the middle, that would be pitta.
Yep.
It's not really wet and it's not really dry. Or you could have something like a really dense cake,
Hmm.
and that's kapha. It's heavier. It's more watery.
Yeah.
So that like the breads are the same basic ingredients, but their constitution will be different.
Yeah.
The same within us. We'll have a physical constitution, an emotional constitution, and a spiritual constitution.
Wow.
So that if you know your dosha, if you know that you have a constitution with more fire, then you treat the fire.
Okay.
You treat the fire. You always pay attention to it.
So is there, when you're saying kind of depending on when you were born, is there kind of a way to identify
Mhm.
what differently than like a personality test necessarily?
Yeah. Yes.
Looking at physically when you were born.
It has to do not so much from a astrological standpoint.
Okay.
It's just that when you were conceived at that moment of your parents' constitution, it
Okay.
could not affect your constitution.
Right.
So the state that your mother and father were in determined your constitution.
Oh, that's terrible.
I know it, right? Think about that. And then I think about what I've given to my children when they were conceived. So that's part of it because it can't not be inherited.
Yeah.
And then there are other factors. There are environmental factors. There are timing factors, the time of season, and all of those
Yeah.
things.
Well, my brain is a very I'm a logical thinker and I believe in energy and I'm not as in depth as I think a lot of people are, but I at least acknowledge, even if I can't explain it, I acknowledge that it exists sort of thing. And the phrase I always go back to is energy never dies. It just transfers, right? And you can feel people's energy. Like when someone walks in the room and they're in a foul mood, you can't help but feel that, even if
Absolutely.
and it's beyond just even if you don't interact with them, you can feel it.
Right.
And you saying that whatever your parents were like at the time of conception is that makes sense. That
Mhm.
energy was
It
transferred.
was transferred. The same philosophy exists in yoga philosophy. No matter can just arrive. It's transformed. So
Yeah.
this is a really interesting concept in the line of health of Ayurveda that I really love. So let's say you come to me and you say, Amy, I've lost all my energy. I'm exhausted. I am tiring after this. I'm having trouble sleeping or my sleep is broken and I'm doing a little intake. And I say, let's go back, Kaitlin, for a moment. First of all, you didn't lose any of your energy. It can't be lost. What the Ayurvedic yogic term or phrase would be is my energy has been either um, constricted
Mhm.
or congested or made dormant or something else has become aggravated.
Okay.
So if you think of scales, this sort of happens. If there's too much fire,
Tips.
then the pitta and the kapha and the vata are going to come down. Or if this is aggravated, this can't not be. Everything can't really be aggravated
Right.
in a sense.
Yeah.
You
And it's kind of like the wheel of life too, right? You can I tell people you can't have all of your cups full at the same time.
right,
It inevitably you take away from certain things, but you find a balance that works for you in your
right,
life at that time.
right.
Yeah.
So going back to this idea of the elements, when you know what your natural constitution is, not so I do know that I have a lot of pitta. I mean, and I'll answer your question about testing. Knowing that I do, I'm going to use my pitta, the nature of fire, if I'm in balance,
Mm.
to take me forward without a lot of obstacle. I won't drag my feet. I don't change my mind a lot.
Mm.
That's a pitta quality.
Okay.
So a vata quality would be actually not attached to a lot of things and changing your mind very quickly
Mm.
and having the ability to be really creative, but maybe not anchored in making a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Or for somebody who has a lot of kapha, they'll make a decision after a lot of research, a lot of thoughtfulness, a lot of scientific data,
Yep.
not so gutturally,
Yeah.
practically. And they won't change their mind.
Yeah.
And they might stay the course of something much longer than somebody would with a lot of vata nature or pitta
Yeah.
nature. So the way to determine this, I mean, there are ways I can look at a body and body types have a certain energy.
Okay.
Um, if you see an Ayurvedic doctor, they're going to read your pulse.
Okay.
And it's very fascinating. Each finger reads the amount of vata, pitta, and kapha in the body.
Oh wow.
So if I were to do your pulse,
Yeah.
I would be paying attention to, actually it would be here. It's your left hand and my right.
Okay.
I would be paying attention to how much vata I feel under my index finger, pitta, and kapha. And then there are depths of the pulse. There's this depth, and this
Okay.
depth. So it's very intricate.
Yeah.
The doctor might look at your tongue.
Okay.
The doctor will look at your eye. The doctor might ask you questions about digestion. Digestion is the biggest key to what's out of balance in Ayurveda.
Okay. Wow.
They'll look at your skin. So there are a lot of markers.
Yeah. So basically, if you want to test to see what you have the most of, what energy you have the most of, essentially, you should see an Ayurvedic
Practitioner. It's quite deep. It's quite
Yeah.
deep.
Okay.
And there are layers to it
Yeah.
because, as you know, we're not just what's going on emotionally.
Right.
We're not just what's going on physically.
Yeah.
And we're not what's going on mentally. So all of those things are taken into account
Yeah.
for.
Well, and as you were talking too, I was like, well, I'm obviously not just Pitta because I do tend to now do a lot of research and be very grounded in decisions and not change my mind and stubborn and so I'm definitely a lot of those.
That's an earth quality.
But also I think it's a learned quality in some aspects.
That's it.
Because as what I would assume as more of a Pitta person and just taking action without much thought and just a lot of ambition.
Right.
That's kind of how I started my business. I was just I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll probably figure it out.
Right.
now I have learned that I have a little more success if there's some planning behind it and some research behind it and more intentional thought and a plan.
And so you make a point that Ayurveda makes, which can be difficult, especially if you're a layperson trying to figure out what dosha is there,
Yeah.
is what we see might be learned, not natural.
Oh.
And so part of seeing a doctor or a practitioner is that because they're reading energy, it's not just what's happening now. They can clarify, oh no, this is actually there's too much fire.
Oh.
So people like to say, well, I have all this pitta, so I should be fiery. Actually, it could be that the fire is being mishandled,
Yeah.
or that there's all this earthiness, but it's being mishandled so that it results in depression.
Mm.
So there's a difference between learned and nature.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so that's what actually part of the medicine is looking at. Is this actually the natural state,
Right.
or is this a condition
Yeah.
or conditioned?
And then what to do about it
And what to
bring
do
things
about
back
it.
into balance.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I'm so happy we're talking about that.
Yeah. It's a fascinating
Yeah.
science.
It is. It really. Well, now I'm gonna have to have like an Ayurvedic practitioner come on next and like dive into other things that I didn't even know that I didn't know.
We have a wonderful local, Andrea Russell.
Okay.
She is a resource that we are lucky to have here in Madison.
Okay. I'm gonna remember that.
Yeah.
I don't have anything to write it down right now.
I will
but
remind you. I will
you.
remind you. Yeah.
I also want to make sure at some point I ask about just like you personally as a high achiever. Like this entire podcast, the premise of it is about thriving in the modern world. And I feel like you've had a lot of success. But success is also defined differently by person. You know, I think of anyone who takes the leap to be an entrepreneur, but also live intentionally and recognize their rhythms and patterns and pivot in life where it works for them and it serves them. That's kind of how I define success, but that still looks different for everyone. So my question is,
Mm.
what do you do in your personal life to make sure that your health stays kind of in that top priority and doesn't just get put on the back burner when you have like a new dream or a new rhythm?
It's a really good question. I'm going to answer it by first giving an example of how I would recommend to somebody who's interested in being an entrepreneur, knowing if it's right for them.
Mm,
So I opened my first yoga studio in 2003 and I've had 4 consecutive spaces. I have 3 graduates who've opened their own studios out of a couple hundred. So you see the percentage is small.
yeah.
And all 3 of them had come to me at one point and said, do you think I should do this?
Mm,
And the biggest question I present to them is always, why do you want to do it?
mm,
And if they can really identify why. And that is the question I still ask myself when I am thinking about making a decision, or I get and I get excited about things.
Yeah.
I have enough Vata, which is this like creative, like, I have another idea.
Yeah.
A lot of my direction will come out of a conversation. I'll say, I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
And then I can't not go back on my word. So I start to pursue something. But in that pursuit, I can lose sight of something else.
Yeah.
So the habitual question for me, or the useful question, is why?
Yeah.
Why am I doing this? Why would I take this next step?
Mhm.
From a practical standpoint, like a financial standpoint, but usually for me, that's the second question.
Yeah.
It's more, how is it going to serve me?
Mm.
Will it serve me? And how is it going to serve somebody else?
Mm.
And if I can't answer those whys, I know pretty quickly that it's probably coming from like my ego. It's just some idea, like something I have as
Yeah.
an idea that would qualify as success.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, and I can relate to that because I've owned a Better Body for 13 years.
Yeah.
And people will come to me that I know that are massage, and I used to teach at the Madison College Therapeutic Massage Program, and people would ask like, "I want to start my own business. Do you have any advice?" And kind of similarly, what I tell them is like, owning your own business can be great. It's also a lot more work because doing massage isn't all you're going to do then. So you have to make sure that you're okay with being the marketing
Right.
person and the bookkeeping person and in charge of all the finances and invoicing. And you have to be the tech support person, wear all these different hats. And that's going to be your day to day. And you're still going to have to see your massage clients because that's the part where you make money.
Right.
So I kind of caution people and say, like, think about that. Is that how you want your life to be? And because I think people don't consider that. They think more logically about the like, oh, this could be fun or this could be exciting. And it's like,
Absolutely.
you just weigh your options basically and think about sit with that. What is a day in the life going to be like?
I think some of the mistakes I've made were in sizing. I'd say that to somebody new too, like maybe start small.
Hmm.
And I did that correct in the beginning.
Yeah.
I started small. And then I made a jump after a few years that was quite big. That took me a while to not recover from, but um, be in balance with.
Mm-hmm.
And then I let myself stay at that place for a while. But I think it's easy to become complacent as an
Oh,
entrepreneur.
yeah.
And so then where is that line between how much more do I step into the next thing for growth
Yep.
and when do I wait for it to happen? And so that timing game has always been part of my next step.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, I think that's a good point too. And I talk a lot about small steps just as like a general philosophy,
Hmm.
whether you're taking steps to get healthier or you're taking steps to build business. That's kind of how I built mine, is just like little by little over the years, and do it in a way that you don't get overwhelmed. You can, handle. There's still always going to be harder times than others,
Right.
but I,
And
I,
developing patience.
yeah.
Developing patience. And here's one I wish I would have told my younger self: asking for help.
Oh, yes.
It's been a theme that I've been talking quite a lot about. Was not in my wheelhouse. I didn't know what that word meant for many, many years.
Yes. Same.
And that was foolish, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I wanted my kind of to hold my hand close.
Mm.
And I'm that way generally, but showing somebody my hand that I trusted was beneficial, and I could have done it sooner.
Hmm.
And I think it's important to find a mentor
Yeah.
and to find somebody that has gone a little ahead of you and ask for advice, but also on the same hand, have some faith and take a risk.
Yeah. Yeah. The right balance.
The right
But
balance.
like the balance keeps coming back. So, do you like being a mentor? Like, people have
I love it.
naturally come to you. Do you do any part of that like as a professional piece, or is it just people that kind of come to you more on a casual?
I wouldn't advertise myself as a mentor, but the work that I do definitely in holding space for people when we do private work is mentoring.
Yeah.
But more than me giving advice, it's it's conversational, actually, now that I think about it.
Yeah.
I'm asking questions, I'm helping them investigate,
Hmm.
I'm helping them get a clearer picture of why they might want to take the next step.
Yeah.
Like you said, whether it's for their health or if it actually is for
Yeah.
somebody who wants to do something from a fiscal standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, and that's kind of similar to like how I work as a coach. Is yes, there might be some advice built in there if you ask a very specific question, but a lot of times it's, what do you want? What is success for your life? What is
Right.
health for your life? Why is that important? How do you picture that? Like, what is the end goal that motivates you? Those sort of things, and then work backwards and come up with some steps.
Right. I think for me, there's two stages. There's building a toolbox,
Mm-hmm.
which is maybe the more fun part, taking workshops and going on retreat
Mm-hmm.
and sitting with a teacher
Good retreat.
and reading a self-help book and starting to have concrete understanding of theory.
Mm-hmm.
That's building the toolbox. But then using the tools is difficult.
Yeah.
And it takes practice.
Mm-hmm.
Shiny tools are really pretty in a toolbox.
Oh yeah. I have
And
lots of self-help books.
so do I. And, yes, they're important.
Yeah.
But little steps, like you said, or implementing and taking a little action
Yeah.
is where the magic starts to happen.
Yeah. I agree. Have you ever read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear?
I have not, but
Is it on the list?
it's on the
Okay.
list. It's on the list.
That's a good book. When you read it, you'll probably understand what I mean, is that there's all these little tidbits you can
Yeah.
take away from the book. And it's a decent sized book.
Yeah.
But listening to that book, I'm like, I don't even have to read the whole book all at once. I can listen to like one chapter at a time and go, okay, how could I apply this? Or how could I take this to make an improvement? And that's kind of like the little small steps,
Yeah.
bite-sized chunks.
During the time that Kelly and I were working on our book, Living the Sutras, she's a journalist by training. And so, I'd say something and Kelly would say, well, okay, hold on. I'm going to go research that. So she would do the research of my sort of, statements between science, modern science, and yoga. And we were working, I think it was on the sutra around what's called Kapha, which means discipline.
Okay.
And she went and did this whole bunch of research. She went down the rabbit hole of this coach for the Tour de France.
Okay.
And if I remember right, I think it was a woman. And they had placed something like sixth, seventh one year. And she said to her team, within 2 years, she wanted to take the gold. And I can't remember her name, but maybe we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
And so she started this practice that she called the 1%. And she felt that if everything could make an improvement 1% every day, from having 1% better sheets in the hotel room that they slept on the night before the race, having 1% better oiled the tires, having
Yeah.
1% better clothing that was less wind resistant, eating a diet that was 1%,
Yeah.
not 25% better.
Yeah.
And I'm sure some things were more than that, but that was her margin.
The idea.
The idea. I think they took the gold the following year. It was almost immediately. And she said she made it everywhere. It wasn't making everybody cut 2 minutes off their time, and that was the goal.
No.
It was improving everything they put their finger on
Yeah.
by just a little bit,
Because it's all connected.
because it's all connected.
I love that.
And so I was fascinated by that research.
Yeah.
And it says we don't have to do that much at once.
Yeah.
We just have to be conscious of more of it
Mm-hmm.
at the same
Love
time.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes what people and myself don't want to hear. I'm like, oh, I don't want to have to worry about that stuff though. That's seemingly unrelated.
Right.
I want to avoid that.
And it's just, for me, it's in relating it to you, it's about being more mindful all of the time.
Yeah.
So the way that, I close the door behind me
Yeah.
is quieter.
Mhm.
The way that I step into a room and give myself a beat to look at you is more present, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
In the ashram that I visit, it isn't necessarily enforced, but it's a common practice that when you step into a space, depending on where you are, what room you're in, you might step in with your right foot.
Oh,
And when
okay.
you step out of a room, you might step out with the left. And so just those kind of like conscious moments switches the tone. It's like 1% more conscious.
Yeah. Yeah. And that awareness, because I think so many, especially with physical uh, habits and movements and gestures, we're kind of unaware of them
Right.
sometimes, what our physical body is doing in space when we're when we're up here, thinking about 100 other things.
And that takes me back to what we mentioned way in the beginning about resting.
Mm.
Was saying, since October, I haven't been in this old rhythm.
Yeah.
And the first few weeks, I did not resist rest. I let myself sort of sleep in. My husband was like, I've got the kids, even though he was working, he kept his rhythm of taking our daughter to school, getting up and helping with breakfast. And I'm not a sleeper inner. I mean, I wake up first,
Yeah.
but I didn't rush to start activity.
Do something.
I went and sat, I did a meditation, or I went in our den and I put on, Candy TV,
Yeah.
and just let myself watch a series that I hadn't
Yeah.
binged in a year.
Yes.
And, then that rhythm, that was a couple weeks, which was good. And then my Pitta came back up to the surface and was like, great, I had a little rest.
Yep.
And so in November, which isn't long ago, I've really intentionally started to create a new rhythm that I haven't experienced in 2 decades.
Ooh.
And it's exciting. It's unfamiliar. It's humbling. It's also really telling that I was moving at a pace that was unhealthy for the last few years, some out of necessity, some out of that word habit.
Yeah.
And being able to identify that I wasn't being honest with myself in the
Yeah.
rhythm that I was in.
Yeah.
And that's a humbling thing to come to when you have the tools.
Yeah. Yep.
And intentionally saying, I'm going to shift.
I love that.
It's difficult.
Yeah. But you taking the time to rest, probably what I'm hearing, at least, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, sounds like it created the space to allow that realization. Because when you're going
That's it.
100 miles an hour, you kind of have your blinders on and you're not recognizing until something happens where you hit a wall or you just get to a point where you're like, I can't keep doing this.
That's it.
Yeah.
Or we might get there and say, why can't I keep doing this?
Yeah.
I think that happens to us.
Yeah.
We have this level of expectation.
I should just be able to
I
go
should
100
be
miles an hour all the time.
good.
Yeah.
And I think it's, we use that word again, it's a little dangerous.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous social norm.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that, regardless of what rhythm you're in life, whether you're kind of in that phase of where you're going 100 miles an hour or you're in more of a period of allowing you more rest, what are some things that you do for your own health, like no matter what phase and rhythm you're in?
Well, routine. And whether that routine looks like it did a year ago or 10 years ago, I think routine is the key to success. Not the same routine, but having a routine.
Yeah.
And that might be a quarterly routine. That might be, again, there's these periods, there are these rhythms. But I found very quickly after those first couple weeks that because I didn't have a timeline, I didn't have to do my regular routine in order to get in.
Yeah.
So like working full time, if I'm going to sit for meditation or do a little bit of movement, it's got to be built in or it won't happen.
Yeah.
That's my nature. And I know that. I'm not somebody who says, no matter what, I go to the gym.
Yeah.
I'll say, you know what? It's too busy. I'm not going to go.
Yeah.
And I'll give myself that pass. But then eventually, without the routine, I'm out of it.
Yeah.
So routine for me, whatever that is.
Yep.
And so I just sit down in November and say, gosh, what do I want my new routine to look like? Is it realistic? Is it feasible? So routine is like the basis.
Yeah.
If I had to like hand pick things that could go by the wayside for a while and things that couldn't, morning quiet is like
Top of the list.
top of the list. It's
Okay.
a non-negotiable.
Okay.
And if that means I have to get up before everybody else, it's fine.
That's fine. Okay.
If I don't have it, my rhythm is like ungrounded.
Yeah.
I know it. I worked for my yoga teachers in my 20s in their office. And it was kind of magic because I went to their home, which was also their school.
Okay.
And so you were in kind of a sacred space all of the time. And in the very back of this place, like your space they had an office, which felt most like an office and not like a temple.
Yeah.
And so I worked in there. And one morning, it was probably 22 or 23. I must have been sitting at my desk like this. And my teacher, Charles, walked in and he said to me, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "I don't know." And he goes, "You didn't meditate. You are required to meditate to work here. Go." And I hadn't. And I was in this routine. And, it was my boss had a policy of having a meditation practice and saw it. I couldn't even get away with it. He was like, "What's wrong with you? You didn't meditate.
I might have to do that here.
And do it." And so I was sent to go meditate, and like, right. It was just to go sit for a few minutes, to get into a space that feels like I'm in my space. Like, what space am I in today? Where am I?
Yeah.
And it's not so much about achieving that's the time not to achieve.
Yeah.
The time not to achieve.
Just to be present.
Just to be present. And to have a moment to be self-honest with whatever things are really happening.
Yeah.
Creatively, negatively, physically, spiritually.
Yeah, not judging it, just
Not judging it.
being with it.
And if I do that, that's my non-negotiable.
Yeah.
And the beauty about that is you don't have to have any equipment for it.
Yeah.
You don't have to have anything.
You can do it anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Especially because people talk so much about like morning routines and they can be helpful. But I think the part to point out there is that just the time, regardless of whatever you do with it, making sure that there's the time to just be with yourself and be quiet and not just jump right into things and stuff in your day.
And I think my teacher, Lisa, this was partnered with Charles at the time. So they co-taught with us. She would say, have a dump journal, because people will come to me, and I'm sure came to her and would say, like, "I can't meditate. I'm just busy thinking about what I have to do." And she called it the dump journal. Sit down and dump it out.
Yep.
Whatever is like you don't want to forget, dump it out, set it down.
And then come back to it.
And then the mind kind of goes, okay, she won't forget it.
Yeah.
It's there.
Uh-huh.
And then just being with whatever is there.
Yeah. I love that.
So a dump journal.
A dump journal. I have given a similar, I don't call it a dump journal, but I'm loving these phrases I'm learning from you today because I have told clients when they can't sleep at night, because of whatever's going on, and just write it down.
Yeah.
You can write as much or as little as you want. It might just be like a to-do thing, or it might be like, this is the way I want to express to my coworker or how I'm feeling or whatever, and just writing it down, because then it's physically somewhere.
Right.
And you can put it there and come back to it. But right now it's time for sleep, or whatever is in front of you at that point. Yeah.
I'm a list maker.
I am too. I have a Post-it note obsession. And
to get up.
Like, there's always Post-it notes everywhere. And like things are half checked off and scribbled out. And then you'll see another Post-it note with the same thing on it because it never did. That one is,
Mine's like reused old paper notes because I can't throw away paper. So, it's old paper with notes with other notes.
Yep. It's just piled on. And, like,
Which no Kapha would do. That would make them crazy.
really?
Yes. Oh, that would be like, what
Okay.
in the
So this
God's
is a
name?
Pitta thing,
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe a
Well,
little Vata too.
okay.
Vata's like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
But the Pitta would have to like get it into
A direction.
a direction,
Yeah.
cohesive direction.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm loving this.
It's just like my partner, George, I mean, if he makes a to-do list, there's 2 things on it and it
Oh.
has sat on the desk for a month. And I'll say, did you write it down? He says, oh, I can't write anything down.
Oh, yeah.
And I would lose, I mean, I just don't retain it.
Yeah.
It would be gone and I would be disordered.
Yep.
But he doesn't need to.
Interesting.
He instinctively knows his rhythm.
Yeah. Oh, that's really
It's really interesting.
Yeah. I have tried to get my husband to write some things down. He refuses. I did get him a little book that had a picture of a deer on it because he loves deer, but he's a hunter. That's a whole nother conversation for another day. But I got him that one. He goes, oh, okay, I'll write in this one. He used it for all of one day.
Right.
And I go, was it successful? Did you like kind of writing down your to-do list? And he goes, yeah, it worked. I go, well, why aren't you doing it? And I just don't want to.
Right.
Like, but he gets the things done, so it's like, okay, end of discussion there.
I think for me, mine is about, I feel less anxious if it's down.
Yeah.
It's sort of out of my
Yeah.
front space.
I would agree with that. And then you're not going to forget about it
Right.
and it'll get done. Yeah.
And it leaves room for attachment to what I've written down as well.
Yes. Whatever it is, whether it's like email the person about the furnace or come up with this new idea for a book.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can we talk about your book?
Sure.
So tell me a little bit more about what's in it, because we've talked a lot about doshas and different Ayurvedic things today, but what is your book about?
So there's this classic period of time in yoga that's called Patanjali's yoga or classical yoga. It's where the 8-limbed path of yoga comes from. And that's marked in time about 2,000 years ago. And I make that point because we call that classical yoga. Then there's a pre-classical time, a period that goes back another 500 years.
Oh, wow.
Then there's like the post-Vedic age and the Vedic age and the pre-Vedic age. There's all these different chronological periods of, I'm going to use quotes, yoga.
Okay.
Very different than what we think of modern yoga.
Yeah.
Then for the next 500 years, there's a period that moves toward the origins of physical yoga.
Okay.
And there are about a dozen postures that are 1,500 years old. That's it.
Wow.
And then another 1,000 years goes by, 1,200, before we get to what we think of as the modern yoga today.
Wow.
So the text that we have helped to not transliterate, because we don't do it phonetically. We give the sutra and then an English translation.
Okay.
We don't break down every word because it would be a very complicated transliteration, which exists on the market. There are some beautiful, beautiful, beautiful translations of that. Edwin Bryant's is the one I would pitch if anybody wants to look at the classic transliteration. But ours was designed to outline what the stages of classical yoga are, which basically, in a very simple nutshell, are in 8 stages. You move from the most outer understanding of the world to the most inner understanding.
Okay.
So the first stage is how I relate to the world around me, basically through ethics.
Yeah.
Through non-harming, through establishing right speech, through establishing only taking the resources that you need, moderation. All of those things are part of the external yogas. Then we start to move to the more subtle practices of the physical postures.
Yeah.
Then we move to dealing with energy by the breath and the emotions, and eventually we go to the mind.
Yeah.
So yoga is really a journey inward.
Okay.
It's not this external yoga. All these postures were designed to prepare the body to sit still and go in.
Yeah.
That's it.
Wow.
And so only one little sliver of the physical part of yoga is referred to in this scripture, this study book. So we took the first 2 books of the sutras, primarily there are 4, and made them into chapters focused on these stages and how to practically actually practice them off the mat.
Oh, cool.
That's the whole premise of the book.
Yeah.
So we took the theory and made an example. So early on in the book, if you read the sutras, so it's a workbook.
Yep.
You don't fill in this book, but there are directions. There are journal prompts and things to do.
Okay.
So one of the earliest ones, if you were to start to read the book, the main premise in the early stages of yoga is understanding the lenses that we look through.
Yeah.
They're called vritti in yoga. Vritti.
Okay.
So there are 5 vritti. It's called pancha vritti. So 5 waves or 5 lenses that we look through, and they color our perception. Um, Very simply, memory is one of them. Memory colors your perception.
Yeah.
Your memory of the last 4 times you and I interacted
Yeah.
projected this experience into the future to give you some understanding or bias of whether or not you'd want
Mm.
to bring me on your program. You had to imagine it.
Yeah.
But you had to imagine it based on your memory.
Yeah.
And so those 2 things are not accurate,
Right.
but they're necessary in order to have movement, understand the present.
Yeah.
So that's a vritti.
Okay.
And then within the vrittis, within these different fluctuating lenses, then we have personalized lenses. So on top of the lens of your memory, you have the lens of your upbringing. You have the lens of your conditioning.
Yeah.
You have the lens of your personality.
So essentially, like how you see the world through your lens.
Through your lenses, and those lenses are either going to allow you to live joyfully or with suffering. I mean, that's kind of the idea of a lot of Eastern philosophy.
Yeah.
And so the classic Yoga Sutra that was codified by a sage called Patanjali outlined practices that would do 2 things. 1, give you clarification, and 2, essentially learn the mind to release pain and suffering.
Yeah.
That's basically the essence of yoga. The essence of yoga.
Yeah.
So we explain what these lenses are in the first beginning. And then one of the earliest exercises, if you did the book, you'd read it and it would say, okay, Kaitlin, set a timer for 5 minutes and write down all of the words that you can come up with that describe you. You have to write for 5 minutes.
That's a long time.
It's a long time.
I've done things like that before where you start writing vigorously and then you kind of get to a point where you're like,
Right. So it might start out like as mother,
Yep.
Massage therapist, business owner,
Yeah.
enjoyer of
I love dogs.
dog.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, so you're going to make the list that like sort of is an external list.
Yep.
It might even be a list that I couldn't say.
Yeah.
Like I could say, okay, well, she's the one things I just said, I
Yeah.
know. But I didn't know to say things like fearful of water.
Yeah. Whatever. Like, gosh, I know there's a lot of things.
Like I couldn't write those things down.
Yep.
They would start to become more and more sort of private or more and more sort of unique toward the end of the list.
Yeah.
Then the timer goes off. Part 2 of the exercise is to ask somebody who's very close to you to set a timer for 5 minutes and to write the list about you.
Ooh.
And then you begin to look at the list and you'll start to see like what things you reject,
Yeah.
what things are similar, what things are sort of true or learned.
Yeah.
And then the next exercises begin from that. So it's a self-investigation. That first exercise is like, let's see how we identify ourselves.
Yeah.
One of the 5 causes of suffering, according to yoga, is what's called asmita, which means the ego.
Okay.
And the ego is essentially the part of ourself that we name in order to feel valid in our experience or idealizing something. It's not negative, but I have to know that I have an intense personality.
Yeah.
If I don't know that, I have a misperception of self.
Yeah.
And so it's not wrong, but it's not good or bad.
Yeah.
So ego is like identifying, without judgment, but it still causes suffering.
Yeah.
It's still a cause of suffering.
Yeah.
So the egoless part of ourself, the part that we don't hold on to a strong identification of, or something we're not trying to uphold, is the part that allows us not to have that suffering. Yoga would say the universal self or the divine self.
Okay. I'm super interested by this. I'm like already thinking about like all the times it would be fun to do that exercise with staff or my partner.
Absolutely.
I know it's very different, but I just took the DISC assessment and I'm into just things like that where it's like self-exploration, like understanding yourself on a deeper level.
Right.
I think that's the key, like you were saying before, of like developing toolkits but then knowing how to use the tools for use.
And remembering the tools are in there.
Yeah.
It's like a toolbox that hasn't been opened for a while. You forget what's in there.
Yeah.
And so regularly, shining the tools is important.
Yeah.
Regularly taking them out and caring for them. And not maybe they don't get used, but they get seen. It's like refined.
Yeah. This to me like kind of sounds like the type of book that I could read today and then come back to it a year from now and read it again and it would land completely differently?
It's a very short book. It's a quick read. We actually recommend in the very beginning of the introduction to read it and not do the exercises.
Okay.
You could probably read this text in about an hour and a half.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's because a lot of the text is exercise. You'll skip the exercise,
Okay.
maybe 2 hours.
Yeah.
It's a fairly quick read if you don't do the work. And then we suggest starting at the beginning
Back to
because it's an overview of the philosophy, which might be really new. But you don't have to have practiced yoga to be able to do
Yeah.
the exercises.
I love that. Well, and that's kind of your goal with it, right? Is to make it like accessible to.
That's exactly it. And then a couple years later, this came out in 2020, I think, is our exercise deck.
Oh,
And yeah, pick one. So you'll see three colors.
one.
Now, one category is exercise, one is journaling, and one is a practice card.
Okay.
So there are 18 categories. So what category?
I got replenish and
Grounding. So all the blue cards are the replenish card,
Okay.
which is something to like an activity to do, something to engage in, not just theory. So Kaitlin chose grounding. There are 3 grounding cards. So there's a grounding yellow card, a grounding blue card, and a grounding green card. So you could choose to actually, sort your cards and decide, today I'm doing 3 things for grounding.
Yeah.
Or you might pull 3 different cards
Yeah.
and say, I'm going to do a practice, an investigation, and an activity.
I'm almost imagining this could be like a very cool way. You know how you were saying your non-negotiable is essentially having some time for
Yeah.
yourself. I do think people struggle with that. I do think when you
I do
sit in
too.
silence and you're not doing something, people are like, I should be doing something. I should be being productive. I should be getting to my tasks. And this would be
Right.
a cool way to like ease them into,
And that would
take a few drops of essential oil and yeah, and just sit with, then you're focusing on like a smell, but it's something subtle enough to, that's what I'm picturing these.
That's it. And that's kind of how I think of the work I do. Like the book was out of necessity. I couldn't find something on the market
Yeah.
that helped people integrate the ancient text. And then the book came out. I was like, well, what practices?
Yeah.
And Kelly and I said, well, let's come up with a card deck that's actually something practical to do that's rooted in the philosophy of yoga.
I love this.
So they picked a grounding card.
Yeah, now I'm going to have to do some extra grounding today. This is great. Yep. This is so great. Where can people find these and buy them?
So you can listen to our podcast, which is Living It, which was an offspring of the book.
Okay.
Anywhere that you can listen to podcasts. You can find Living the Sutras and the Living It deck on Amazon. You can find it on Shambhala, which is our publisher. You can find it in most Barnes and Nobles and different bookstores. But Shambhala publisher is a wonderful resource. It's our publisher. It's a wonderful resource for a lot of different books geared towards self-help.
Oh, okay.
And so people can go on and type in a category like movement, entrepreneurs. It's all from a spiritual perspective. There is kind of a spiritual publishing house.
I love that.
So those are good resources. My website, which is tantramadison.com, has upcoming events. I'm leaving for India in 3 weeks.
Yeah, I didn't talk to you about it, but I saw it on I think Instagram.
Yeah,
it's exciting.
It's so this is an Ayurvedic ashram.
Okay.
And so we will be in treatment for 2 weeks with an Ayurvedic doctor. Everybody will have an assessment every morning. I will lead a meditation and a practice on sunrise. Then we have Ayurvedic food for 2 weeks, and Ayurvedic massage and different treatments daily.
And when is this?
It's the 25th of January through the 9th of February, and there are spaces left if anybody wants to hop on a plane.
It's so exciting. I would need to plan something like that at least a year in advance.
Yeah, but my retreat schedule is on the website, and I love a personal email. I'm, seeing people privately.
Amazing.
People could reach out through the website.
For yoga and mentoring?
For yoga and mentoring.
Okay, fantastic.
Speaking of Pitta, so I would be remiss not to bring you an oil today.
Oh.
This is Winter's Pitta Supportive Oil.
Okay.
And it is my gift to you.
Thank you. Can I smell it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is all 100% Ayurvedic plant essences. So almond oil is really beneficial for heat.
Yep.
So there's some almond oil and there's jojoba. And then I don't know if you've probably heard of like Nag Champa incense.
No.
Okay, so it's a really traditional, India is filled with Nag Champa.
Okay.
If you smell it, it's like the smell of India. You'll know.
Yeah.
Champa is basically, it's oil from a magnolia plant.
Okay.
And so Pitta does really well with sweet essences.
Okay.
Because sweet pacifies fire. So
Okay.
for someone who doesn't, like, I don't eat a lot of sweets, I'm not attracted to them. It's
Yeah.
typically Pitta isn't. So if Pitta's high, you should eat something sweet,
Oh,
which is you're
okay.
often going against what, like, my nature is spicy and salty.
Yeah, same. Yep. Okay.
So champa's sweet. There's a geranium in there, which is a sweet oil, and palmarosa.
I can smell this, the geranium.
So those are all kind of sweet flowers. So they reduce the aggravated Pitta.
I love this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have a oil line as well.
So thank you for sharing so much of your journey and for talking about your book and your cards and just sharing your wisdom. This has been truly incredible. I have no idea what time it is and how long this episode is going to be because I'm like, we could probably
We could keep going.
an hour. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank you because, being invited to speak helps me even get clear.
Yeah.
That practice of talking about what's important
Yeah.
is really valuable. So
Yeah.
we have to talk. We have to communicate.
Great. Yes, we'll do more of these.
We'll do more of these.
So Amy shared where you can find her. And we'll post your bio and the links to those things and your retreat as well, because there's a couple spaces left in the show notes. So you can reach out to her if you have any questions. But thank you so much for being here, Amy. This was a pleasure. We'll have to do it again. And thank you all for joining us today on the Holistic High Achiever. Please like and rate and subscribe to today's episode. If you are anything like me, you probably thought of other people during this conversation that would resonate with this content. So please share it with them. It helps so much. Until next time, friends, keep embracing your journey and kicking ass.